Hey everyone, it's Lori. Um, I am here today with my wrap up of my CathLit 2019 challenge. So this was a reading challenge that I believe it's Haley from Carrots for Michaelmas, which is a blog that is very enjoyable, came up with for 2019. And I'm really hoping she's going to come out with a 2020 version. I haven't seen it yet. Anyway, the point was to read 19 different Catholic books in 2019, and so there were a bunch of different challenges. So I have stacks of books over here, and I thought I'd run through and show you what books I read and what challenge they were for, give you a brief thoughts on what I thought of the book. So the first challenge was a spiritual memoir, and so for that, oh, and I will point out, I tried to shop my shelves for this challenge. So most of these were already in my house prior to starting this challenge. Not all, I will point out which ones weren't. But for a spiritual memoir, I picked Sure to Flame, A Year with St. Therese of Lisieux by Heather King. This one was a very interesting book. I read this towards the beginning of the year. This might have been the first one I picked up. So basically, she found that she really connected to the story of Saint Therese, and so she kind of reflected on that and on her life. I feel like the A Year With thing is kind of gimmicky because I don't think this really took place within a year, but I feel like that's a big thing with books, a year with this saint or a year with that saint. So my only complaint is the title. But I felt like this was a very good spiritual memoir. So if you're looking for one of those, I do recommend this one. The next challenge was a classic spiritual work. And this is one I procrastinated on until the very end of the year. So this was also in my December wrap-up. And that's Abandonment to Divine Providence by Jean-Pierre de Caussade. Also have a handy-dandy little classics made simple guide that kind of gives some background information that was helpful for reading this. So Father Caussade was a Jesuit priest, and at one point he was kind of the spiritual director to a group of nuns. And so this book is made up of letters that he wrote to those nuns, kind of giving them spiritual direction and encouraging them to abandon themselves to the will of God and realize that all of the things in their life have been put there by God for them. So that's like a super simple version. I did mark this up a lot. I do plan to reread this someday. It was kind of a lot for such a small little book, but I can see why it is a spiritual classic. Next up was a book about Mary, and on my shelves I happen to have quite a few books by Immaculée Ildegaza, or however you properly pronounce her name. I'm probably getting it wrong. To admit, I have several of her books, but this was the first one that I read. Immaculée was a survivor of the Rwandan genocide, so I'm finding it hard emotionally to get to her books. But this is her book about a Marian apparition in the small community of Kibeho in Rwanda. And it goes through the different visionaries that saw Our Lady and the messages from Our Lady. And this was a very interesting book about a Marian apparition I knew very little about. Next up, we have a book by a Catholic novelist, and I read Lord of the World by Monsignor Robert Hugh Benson. I just recently started a book about literary converts, and today read the chapter about Robert Hugh Benson, whose father happened to be an Anglican bishop. I did not know that. This is an interesting novel. So it's kind of like the end of time, the second coming of Christ sort of thing. It's written to be kind of futuristic, but it was written long enough ago that the futuristic elements are a little bit strange. But you have two different main characters that you go back and forth between. One of them is a priest and one of them is a government official. So it was very interesting. I think I read this maybe in November. This is one I'd also like to read again, because I feel like I didn't quite get the whole point my first time through. Next challenge was a book by a pope, and I picked The Apostles by Pope Benedict XVI, and I picked it because it was small. It actually was a lot more accessible than I expected it to be with Pope Benedict, because he's kind of got a big brain. So I was a little concerned that it might be more than I could handle, but he just basically went through all of the apostles and talked about what we know about them, what some tradition is about them, and kind of their impact. So not as scary and intimidating as I thought it would be. Next is a book by a Catholic woman, and for this I chose The Thrill of the Chaste by Dawn Eden. She was not Catholic, I don't believe, at the writing of this book. Now I'm not totally sure, but she is now, so we'll go with good enough. I believe she's a Catholic. She looked in the face. Anyway, so this is basically the story, kind of a bit of a memoir, so it talks about her early life and her upbringing and her parents' divorce and what that kind of did for her in terms of relationships. And then it talks about kind of being a young single, she was covering the music scene as a journalist, and so she was making a lot of very unchaste decisions in her life. She basically was atheist or agnostic, and then she kind of had a spiritual awakening, and then she realized she had to change the way she did things. So this is a very interesting memoir. I think she goes a bit far towards the end in terms of, like, she kind of falls into that there's only one right person out there for any person, and I'm just waiting for Mr. Right sort of thing. And I don't know that that's particularly healthy, but probably healthier than her life choices prior to her conversion to Christianity. So, you know, take from it what you will. But it was an interesting book to read. Next up was a book about liturgy, and so I chose The Lamb's Supper, The Mass is Heaven on Earth by Scott Hahn. So this talks about the book of Revelation and how we can see the book of Revelation in the Mass and how we can see Mass in the book of Revelation. So it was very interesting. I used to find Scott Hahn a little intimidating. He's a lot easier for me now than he used to be. I must just be reading a lot smarter books these days. So this one was pretty good, but nothing like earth-shattering to me. But, you know, if you don't know much about the book of Revelation, or if you're unfamiliar with the Mass, this might be a great way to kind of see how the two relate. Next up is a book by an early church father, and I kind of cheated on this one. Early church fathers scare me a little bit, but I did read A Year with the Church Fathers, Patristic Wisdom for Daily Living by Mike Aquilina. So this is all daily reflections, and I'm not very good with daily things, so I didn't do this daily. I just did chunks at a time. So it has a little like reflection, and then a little excerpt from an early church father, and then some things to consider, and a closing prayer for each day. So if you are a person who can handle a page a day sort of thing and not like lose it for months and months at a time like I do, this is a beautiful book. I love the binding. It's got very pretty font and artwork and everything. I'm just not the page a day kind of person. So, you know, a little bit of a cheat because it's not like a whole thing by a early church father, but it had a lot of stuff from early church fathers in it. So that's what I did. And then next is a conversion story, and I love conversion stories, and this is one my husband recommended to me, Night's Bright Darkness, a modern conversion story by Sally Reed. And Sally Reed kind of tells the story of going from basically being an atheist to being a Catholic, and she's a poet, so it's just terrifically poetically written, just gorgeous writing in here, and it just goes through all of her difficulties, and then not just her difficulties before converting, but also her difficulties in converting, that, you know, there were people in her life that were not super thrilled about her her choice to become Catholic. So I really highly recommend this one. It's just so beautifully written, and if you enjoy a good conversion story, you would enjoy Sally Reed's. Next up is an apologetics book, and I always have a hard time determining. I'm having disasters here. I always have a hard time determining what is an apologetics book and what is not. So I went with Theology and Sanity by Frank Sheed. I think this might have also been a book for my Catholic Read Your Way to Heaven challenge, so I might have doubled up on this one. I really like Frank Sheed's writing. It's very clear to me. I haven't found that everybody agrees with me on that, but I just feel like this is one I definitely can come back to again and learn more from. But I did make some different markings in it, and just generally speaking, I think I've read about 3 books by Frank Sheed, and he just speaks very well to me. Next up is the challenge, a book by an Orthodox writer. And so for that one, I went with The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is a book that I did purchase this year. I did have this on Kindle, and I did also read this with a book buddy, and I was just having a hard time getting through it on Kindle. It's actually the first book I downloaded to my Kindle and tried to read 10 years ago, and I got, I don't know, maybe a third of the way through and never completed it, and so I started it again on Kindle, and I was struggling there, so I checked out a copy from the library, but this is not the size of book that's very easy to read from the library, particularly when we're talking Russian literature. It's a little different if it's a fantasy novel. So I just went ahead and picked up a Dover Classic Thrift whatever edition. It wasn't very expensive. I did enjoy this. It's much easier to get through in a paper copy because then you at least know how much more you have to go. So we've got several different brothers and their father, and then the father is murdered, and one of the sons is accused. So that's kind of the general overall theme of the book. Well worth the read, but it's a challenge. It's chunky. The next challenge was a hagiography, and much like the apologetics book, I wasn't exactly sure what exactly makes a hagiography. So I went with The Golden Thread, a novel about St. Ignatius of Loyola by Louis de Waal. I have several of his, they're kind of like historical fiction biography type things, and that's as close as I get to understanding what a hagiography is. I haven't read any of them. I picked several of them up when our local bookstore was changing hands, because the person who was buying it was not Catholic, so she was clearing out a whole bunch of the Catholic books. So I think I picked up 3 or 4 of them for $1 a piece. But this is the first one I actually have read. I enjoyed the kind of subplot. There were 2 other characters that kind of were involved in the story of St. Ignatius of Loyola, but they also had separate parts where they were apart from St. Ignatius of Loyola. And I kind of enjoyed their story maybe a little bit more than the St. Ignatius of Loyola part of the story. But it was very interesting and gave me some perspective on, the history of St. Ignatius, because I did go to a Jesuit school. I do know quite a bit about St. Ignatius. But it just kind of gave him a little bit more of a personality, a little bit more of a storyline than the very kind of quick version that I have always known. Next up is a long Catholic book. So that one, I reread Lord of the Rings. I love these books. They're very easy to reread. I probably should have challenged myself to read something else, but I enjoyed this. This was a great reread. I did it right at the beginning of the year, or at least started right, maybe even before the year started. I'm not really sure, but I was kind of doing a read along with a group, and I think we were trying to finish it right around Easter. There's some dates that line up with liturgical feasts in these books. So kind of random. I don't know what those dates are off the top of my head, but I always enjoy rereading or re-listening to these. Next up is a book by a Catholic philosopher. So I picked Christianity for Modern Pagans by Peter Kreeft. This is about Pascal's pences or penses. I don't know how you say that. Anyway, so this is like a double philosopher thing because you got Pascal and then you got Peter Kreeft explaining Pascal. Although, to be honest, I struggle so much with Peter Kreeft. Not my favorite author, although I feel like this one was better for me than the other Kreeft book I read last year. So it's kind of nice because he organizes Pascal's thoughts in a way that I can understand. But it's a lot of, like, he'll have, like, Pascal's thoughts in bold and then his commentary on it, and then there'll be, like, sometimes a ton of different footnotes where, like, every third word in Pascal's thoughts will be footnoted so that you have to go read. So I actually used 2 different bookmarks in here for which one of Pascal's things I was on and where I was in the commentary, and I just went back and forth because I found that the easiest way to read this one. For a Catholic classic, I chose the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer. This was also part of the British literature course my girls are doing for school this year. They only had to read certain tales, and so those are marked with tape flags still. But I read the whole thing. It was a lot raunchier than I kind of expected. I mean, I knew there were raunchy parts, but yeah, it was out there. There was a lot of kind of you in it, and a lot of buts. The butt just came up so often in this. So interesting concept, having the travelers all tell tales. A little weird around the edges. Next up was a book by a saint, and so for that, I went with Diary of Saint Maria Faustina Kowalska. She is the saint, the nun who was given a vision of the Divine Mercy image and told to have it made, and she was never very happy with the Divine Mercy image that was made, but it is what it is. This is one that I have had for at least a decade. I asked my mother-in-law for this for Easter a really long time ago, like when my kids were tiny, and I never made it very far in because it's kind of hard to read. So I actually started this with a group of people doing this alongside the Read Your Way to Heaven thing, so I think I might have been partway through when the year started, but I did finally complete the whole thing. It is a little hard because it's a diary, so sometimes it gets confusing, and sometimes it's just a little, I don't know, almost disturbing. Like some of the things that she said, based on her upbringing and her culture, really aren't surprising. But I was really uncomfortable with, like, there's a particular part in here where they kind of baptize somebody, maybe against their will. It's not totally clear when their Jewish family leaves the room. So not sure if that's one of the things I marked. No, it looks like I just marked the novena stuff. I could just use this for doing the Divine Mercy novena. So worth reading, a little difficult to get through. Another kind of big thing, and diaries are just always a little challenging. The next challenge was a book by a non-Catholic that all the Catholics are reading. And when I posted this on my Instagram, somebody asked me if this was my book by an Orthodox writer, because Rod Dreher is Orthodox, but no, this is my book by a non-Catholic that all the Catholics are reading. And I really should say all the Catholics have read, because I'm apparently dead last on this bandwagon. But this was interesting. I did not love this book. I did do a triple book review and discussion of this Strangers in a Strange Land and The Awakening of Miss Prim with my husband. If I can remember, I will link that up in whichever corner it goes in. I never can remember. But basically, Rod Dreher is kind of suggesting we pull back from society and just focus on community. And while there are some parts of that are valid, I also think a lot of it is just out of fear. So it was interesting to read. I'd been meaning to get to it, and this finally made me do it. The second to last book in this challenge is a book about a Catholic monarch. And I wasn't really sure where to go with this, and I didn't have any books about Catholic monarchs because that is strangely specific. So when I was talking to my husband about it, he recommended a book to me. I read it. I loved it. I read it on Kindle, and I had to buy myself a copy because I loved it so much. So this is The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey, and it's a mystery novel, and basically the premise is the detective of this novel, Inspector Alan Grant, has been injured on a case, and he is recuperating in a hospital, and he is bored out of his mind. So a friend brings some different portraits that all had like mysteries behind them, and he picks this one, and it's a portrait of Richard III, and he just basically lies in a hospital bed and researches till he finds out the truth about Richard III, which sounds like the most boring like book ever, but it's fabulous. So I actually have several more books I've gotten by Josephine Tey that I haven't read yet that I want to read because this one was so good, and now I have my very own physical copy of this book as well. And then the last book is a recently published Catholic book. So obviously I have a lot of old books on my shelves. I don't have a whole lot of new books, and I didn't want to buy one for this, so I did get a Kindle copy from a subscription service type thing to read of The Power of Silence by Robert Cardinal Seurat. This one was kind of hard to read in Kindle form. I wish I had had a paper book of this because it was almost split into a couple parts, and I think I would have done a little better had I been able to go back and forth. So there was one part that was just kind of like Cardinal Seurat's thoughts, and then there was another part that was like an interview with him and somebody else. So it was a little bit different. I did read this towards the beginning of the year, so my memory is a little vague on exactly how the format went, but it was a little bit of a different book. So those were the 19 books I read for the CathLit 2019 challenge. If there is a CathLit 2020 challenge, or whatever they want to call it this year, I'm hoping to participate. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that something comes out. And if that is the case, I will be back with a TBR video for that. I was very proud of myself for completing this because it was looking in December like it might not happen because I kind of fell off the wagon over the summer and didn't catch back up. But I did get them all done before the end of the year. So thanks so much for watching. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books or if you have suggestions for me based on any of these books. And I will see you in the next video. Thanks.